Welcome to the History Guy podcast, Counterfactuals. What is a counterfactual? In the context of studying history, it is a kind of analysis where we examine what might have happened had historical events gone differently. As a thought experiment, the goal is to learn and understand history as it is by talking about what it could have been. As a twist on the historical stories that we tell on the History Guy YouTube channel, this is a series of podcasts that dwell on that eternal question: what if? I'm Josh, a writer for the YouTube channel and son of the History Guy. If you're a fan of the channel, you already know Lance, the History Guy himself. To liven up our discussions on what might have happened, we have invited Brad Wagnon, history aficionado and a longtime friend of the History Guy, to join us. Remember that if you'd like to support us, you can find us on Patreon, YouTube, and locals.com. Join us as we discuss what deserves to be remembered and what might have been. On today's episode, we talk about the Demitriads and the time of troubles in 17th century Russia, when chaos engulfed and nearly destroyed the kingdom. What could have gone differently, and what might have been affected? Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
There's a good chance that you're familiar with the story of the Grand Duchess Anastasia, youngest daughter of Tsar Nicholas II. While it was reported that she had been killed along with the rest of her family in 1918, at least 10 different women in history have come forward to claim that they were the Grand Duchess Anastasia. And while the story of Anastasia has been popularized in films and fiction enough that you've probably heard the story, what you might not know is that the Grand Duchess Anastasia was not the first child of a Tsar to have supposedly died as a child, only to have adults come forward years later claiming to be them. Because at the turn of the 17th century, in a time in Russia that was so full of strife that is referred to as the time of troubles, at least 3 different men rose to power claiming to be the murdered Prince Dmitri, youngest son of Ivan the Terrible. It is history that deserves to be remembered. In 1591, Tsarevich Dmitri, youngest son of Ivan the Terrible, died in the city of Oglich. Dmitri and his mother had been sent to Oglich after Ivan's death in 1584. Maria Nagaya, Dmitri's mother, was either the 5th or 7th wife of Ivan the Terrible. Sources disagree. But as the Russian Orthodox Church only recognized the first 3 marriages, by any measure Dmitri did not have a strong claim to the throne. Maria suspected foul play, however, in the form of Boris Godunov, advisor to Dmitri's half-brother, Tsar Fyodor, and the de facto ruler of Russia. She was not the only one. And as the church bell in Oglich rang out the news, the townspeople rose up to protest the suspected assassination. Godunov sent a force to quell the discontent, and after executing some of the townspeople, he demonstrated his authority by punishing the church bell. Yes, the bell. He had it cut down, had its tongue symbolically removed by removing the clapper, had the bell publicly flogged, and then exiled the bell to Siberia. An official commission was sent to determine the cause of Dmitri's death, and they determined that the 8-year-old Tsarevich had fallen on his own knife during an epileptic seizure. He was buried and for a time forgotten. His mother was forced to take the veil in a nunnery. Dmitri's father, Ivan the Terrible, was born in 1530 and ruled Russia from 1533, first as the Grand Prince of Moscow and later as the first Tsar of all Rus. He was a member of the Rurikid dynasty, which had ruled in one form or another over parts of Russia since the 9th century. Ivan's reign heralded many changes that would affect the later history of Russia. He was the first Russian ruler to be crowned Tsar of all Rus, a deliberate and important change, meant to emphasize his power as a sole ruler, and an explicitly religious one as well, with divine right to rule. He instituted a number of reforms that would affect the trajectory of the nation. He revised the law code, ordered the construction of St. Basil's Cathedral, and instituted a number of councils and a feudal Russian parliament. Ivan also established a standing army. He greatly expanded Russian territory and fought wars with mixed results against Sweden, the Ottomans, Poles, and Lithuanians. But Ivan left a complicated legacy. Although Ivan's epithet, the Terrible, was not intended to give the modern connotations of evil or bad, it's actually more properly translated as the Formidable, and he was generally well liked. Ivan the Terrible was given to occasional bouts of rage and sometimes mental instability, something which only grew worse after the death of his beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanova. In 1570, he ordered an attack on the city of Novgorod, which he accused of being disloyal. The estimates of the death toll differ. The first Pskov Chronicle estimated the death toll at 60,000, while some historians number the deaths around 2,000 or 3,000, including the archbishop, who was hunted to death. Almost as disturbing, in 1581, Ivan the Terrible struck his 27-year-old son, Ivan, the heir to the throne, with a scepter during an argument. The blow proved fatal, and Ivan V died on November 19, 1581. His death would lead to the unwinding of the Rurikid dynasty. When Ivan died of a stroke during a game of chess in 1584, he left his third son, Fyodor I, as Tsar. Fyodor, good-natured but simple-minded, was sidelined while Boris Godunov, a former advisor of Ivan, ruled from the background. It was Boris who was in charge when Ivan's son Dmitri was killed in Oglich, and Boris who punished the Oglich Bell. When Fyodor died childless in 1598, Godunov was made Tsar. It was then that the troubles began. The time of troubles in Russia refers to the period after the death of Fyodor, the last Rurikid Tsar, until 1613, when the first Tsar of the Romanov dynasty was crowned. This period was marked by strife, war, and a famine caused when extremely cold summer temperatures wrecked Russian crops between 1601 and 1603. The famine resulted in the deaths of nearly a third of Russia's population, almost 2 million people. Godunov was unable to provide stability. He attempted to feed the poor in Moscow, which led to refugees flocking to the capital. Meanwhile, armed bands terrorized the countryside, and hunger and disease ravaged the country. Into this crisis stepped a man who would begin one of the oddest series of events in Russian history. In 1603, a man named Dmitri appeared in the Poland-Lithuania Commonwealth, claiming to be Ivan the Terrible's son, the Dmitri who had supposedly been killed in 1591. He claimed to have escaped death when the assassins mistakenly killed another boy. Even his mother would eventually confirm the story. Known to history as False Dmitri I, Russia was rife with discontent and ready to accept a change in leadership. In 1604, False Dmitri I invaded with an army of Poles, Lithuanians, Russian exiles, German mercenaries, and Cossacks, and began a series of wars that were so defined by men claiming to be the Tsarevich Dmitri that the wars were called the Demetriads. Tsar Godunov's position was weak. He denied False Dmitri's claims, insisting instead that he was a runaway monk, although it is unclear what evidence he had. Godunov's many enemies gathered to Dmitri, sensing opportunity. Fighting only 2 engagements and badly losing the second, False Dmitri I would have failed if not for the timely, or perhaps untimely, death of Tsar Godunov of a stroke on April 13, 1605. Reluctant Russian forces defected to Dmitri's cause, and on the 1st of June, 1605, Godunov's successor, his son Fyodor, was imprisoned and later murdered. False Dmitri I was crowned Tsar of Russia on the 21st of July, 1605. But False Dmitri I's reign was far from popular. Demetriads accused of bringing foreign influence to the realm, an accusation made stronger by his keeping Polish soldiers in Moscow and at his court, and marrying the Polish princess, Maria Mninzek, who refused to convert from Catholicism to Russian Orthodoxy. On the 17th of May, 1606, less than a month after his marriage, the Kremlin was stormed by conspirators who had earlier supported False Dmitri I. Dmitri attempted to escape through a window, but broke his leg in the fall. False Dmitri I was shot by the conspirators, his body was displayed, and then eventually cremated and reportedly put into a can and fired from a cannon in the direction of Poland. A nobleman named Vasily Shuisky, a leader of the conspirators, was made Tsar, but he was in a precarious position and he was never generally recognized. But the tale of Dmitri was not over yet. In July of 1607, another man appeared, claiming to be Ivan's son Dmitri. Not only that, this man claimed to be False Dmitri I, having miraculously escaped Dmitri's second death, claiming that, apparently, the wrong guy's ashes had been shot out of the cannon. This False Dmitri was well educated, speaking several languages, and possibly the son of a priest or a converted Jewish person. He was even recognized by False Dmitri I's Polish wife. False Dmitri II invaded Russia again, with some success, eventually camping in Tushino, 12 miles from Moscow, and gathering an army of over 100,000 soldiers. He would come to be known as the Rebel of Tushino. Claiming that he would confiscate the land from the nobles, False Dmitri II became popular with the common folks, but False Dmitri II's luck could not last, as the convoluted politics of Russia's neighbors changed the nature of the game. In 1609, in an attempt to shore up his rule, Tsar Vasily signed an alliance with Charles IX, King of Sweden. But Charles's nephew, Sigismund III, the monarch of the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth, was a rival, and the alliance motivated him to invade as part of his goal of reclaiming the Swedish throne that he had held until 1599. And what all of that really means is that False Dmitri II ceased to be a useful pawn in anybody's fight over the control of Russia. Between the approach of the Russo-Swedish army, the defection of most of his Polish troops to Sigismund III, a potential compromise to place Vladislav, Sigismund III's son, on the throne as the Tsar, False Dmitri II was forced to flee. For a while, he lived with and had a child with the Polish wife of False Dmitri I, before he took an army of Cossacks and took control over and ruled most of southeastern Russia. Then he fell prey to internal politics. On December 11th, 1610, Dmitri and several of his nobles took a sleigh to go drinking in the country. Peter Urasov, a Tatar prince and supporter, followed close behind with some of his cohorts, ostensibly as an escort. But Peter had been flogged by Dmitri and was out for revenge. As Stanislaw Żółkiewski, a celebrated Polish commander, would recall in his memoirs, and when the impostor had drunk very well, Urasov drew from his holster a pistol, which he had had ready, and galloping up to the sleigh, first shot him with the pistol, then cutting off his head and hand with his saber, took to the road. But the Dmitri story had still not ended. In 1612, yet another man appeared from a river in Ivangorod, claiming to be Ivan the Terrible's son, at this point killed 3 times. Identified as a former deacon, he convinced an army of Cossacks already raiding around Moscow to support him, and they acknowledged him as Tsar on March 2nd, 1612. False Dmitri III also became known as the Thief of Pskov, as he made the people of the town of Pskov pledge allegiance to him with the threat of destruction. But perhaps Russia was finally getting tired of pretenders to the throne calling themselves Dmitri, because he lasted for only a few months before he was forced to flee Pskov, was betrayed, and then transported to Moscow, where he was killed in July. Anna Anderson, the best known of the women who claimed to be the Grand Duchess Anastasia, sued to be recognized in a German court from 1937 to 1970. It was the longest recorded court case in German history. She was not the Grand Duchess Anastasia. DNA evidence collected in 1991 and 2000 proved definitively that all 3 of Tsar Nicholas II's daughters died with the rest of the family. Likewise, while the identity of False Dmitri I is still unknown, historians don't believe that any of the False Dmitris were actually the sons of Ivan the Terrible. Rather, they were ambitious men who saw opportunity during the time of troubles and were exploited by Russia's neighbors, enemies, and a discontented populace. It would not be until 1613 that 16-year-old Michael Romanov, a descendant of the brother of Ivan's first wife, was unanimously elected Tsar of Russia by a National Assembly, that the country began to recover. Michael Romanov tied up loose ends by having the son of False Dmitri II hanged and his wife strangled. It was a symbolic end to the wars called the Demetriads.
Now for the fun part, where I, the history guy himself and longtime friend of the history guy Brad Wagnon, discuss the different ways that this history could have gone and how that might have changed history as we know it.
Actually, it's this episode, initially I thought it was going to be really difficult, and I need to tell you that there's really quite a bit here. The nice thing was it was a very good excuse to brush up on the Polish-Livonian Commonwealth.
Lithuanian, you mean? But yeah.
I'm sorry, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. As well as Sweden doesn't quite hit her stride at this point, but Sweden certainly is a major player as well.
Yes, and this is it's a period when I'm not really expert on it, but yes, Sweden, Poland, Lithuania, and the Ottomans, as well as the Habsburgs. I mean, they're all major players at the time. So the question is, if Russia is more powerful at the time, how does that change that balance? And then how does that change numerous wars? So, I mean, clearly, the impact is potentially quite significant if Russia can avoid the troubles and maintain central authority and maybe modernize more quickly. Then it starts getting into the weeds of what was going on in the 17th century. And I'm like, ooh, that's not really my speciality there. But I mean, it is fun to study the Polish-Lithuanian and a period in which the Poles dominated Russia is really fascinating when you think, context today.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they occupied Russia twice within about a 30-year span. And
Oh yeah, they were a major European power, a huge European power, and then it's not that long out, a couple hundred years after, that Russia's literally talking about erasing its history so that you don't even know there was a Poland. I wish I was more expert on the era, because this is, because you have this ridiculous stuff where they're flogging the bell, and the guy got shot out of a cannon and then pops up a year later. I've always said, when I die, when they ask what you want to do, I said, when I die, I want you to burn me to ashes and shoot me out of a cannon. And everybody's like, why? And I'm like, because I want to know if I come back. It's happened at least once. Fish my wife out of the convent and ask if it's me.
They will apparently say yes.
But
By the way,
I'm really happy that I did not have a seizure while holding my open knife, because that apparently is a more common in Russia than you would have thought.
Yes, and by the way, as an aside, as a humorous aside, I do definitely want to do my dad joke moment, and that is, yes, the fact that Boris Godunov inspired Boris Badnov of Bullwinkle fame. Clearly, this is a connection.
There's no way that occurred by itself.
I actually hit they do actually mention on a Wikipedia article. I'm not sure, I didn't see any particular citation for it, but they did say that was actually going through their heads when they were naming Boris Badnov. So there was Boris Godunov, or good enough, and
It's
and there is, by the way, because we're going to have to get there. There is a Russian Bigfoot.
Oh yeah, we definitely are going to get to Russian Bigfoot. He could be another Dmitri, right? That's the.
It's, Almas is. Well, actually, they caught one. What was that? They caught one, and they thought they had a big. So no, she had been caught, and then she had fathered 4 children. And when they sequenced the DNA from the children, they found out that she was 100% African. So they thought it was, the whole story is bizarre. Yeah. But who knows? Dmitri maybe is a Bigfoot. Who knew what Ivan the Terrible might?
Oh, well, he had
around
an uncertain number of wives. However, they were mostly after the first 3, they weren't recognized by the church. So
by the church, yeah.
Technically, by that standard, Dmitri was never in line for the throne, but that didn't stop him from trying to get the throne multiple times.
Or from multiple hymns trying to get the throne.
Yeah,
and actually, there's a big chunk of Russian history to that, where pretenders have to have some sort of claim to the throne, even though it's pretty shallow. That's just they have to justify what they're doing. But one of the things I find really interesting about this is it's truly a test of the great man theory. We talk about that all the time when we talk about counterfactual, because this is a period where there was no great man. Clearly, Fyodor was not. Clearly, Boris Godunov was not. And nobody rose to the occasion. And because of that, you get this 15-year crisis, the time of troubles. And to the point where a dude could pop up and say, I'm the dead 9-year-old who fell on his dagger, and people would believe that because they were in so desperate need for someone that had the power to do this. Russia needed Peter the Great 100 years before Peter the Great came along right here. And so it really is. When you ask the question, is the great man theory flawed? Are events really events that were going to occur anyway? This can put a test to that and say, well, you see what happens when no one rises to the occasion. And there's a reason that Ivan got the name, the epithet, the Terrible. There's a reason that Peter got the name, the Great. And there's a reason, that they don't, that doesn't happen in the time of troubles. And so I think it's kind of interesting to look at, what about periods where there was no great man? Is there a sign that maybe, great men do make a difference? And that's one of the counterfactuals, because the real question here is, what if you had a great man? Now, I don't know if Ivan Ivanovich would have been that. But it's certainly an interesting question, because he certainly seems to have had a much better chance of being that than any of the than his half-wit half-brother and his half-wit half-brother's advisor, and the kid that had seizures and fell on his knife. Who knows how good a King Dmitri would have been in any situation.
That's a completely different one of the Dmitris. But one of the things that I think is interesting about this period is that you wonder. If it happening the way it did was important to the way that Russia ended up turning out. Because Ivan the Terrible, of course, advanced the Russian state a lot. but he did it at great cost. And without, not necessarily without failure. I mean, at one point they burned Moscow, but he manages to without him, he was a vital part of this kind of shift from Russia being a backwater to being something of a modern European state. And while this was just one step into that direction, he did what he did, and there might not have been a way for him to do it in any other way. And so the consequences from it, which are part of what end up causing this time of troubles, might have been necessary. Without it, certainly without Ivan the Terrible, I mean, the borders of Russia as we understand them today would be different. And I mean, that was true under Godunov too, is that he did some significant stuff to try to continue to push the borders and to build fortresses and stuff like that. But the weight of events in this case ended up being so heavy that you wonder, is there a great man enough that he could have turned that tide? Because when you had all these issues with the way that they were dealing with serfs, which caused all these. It's one of the reasons why there were so many rebellions, is that they had changed all these rules about serfs, and they used to sell themselves into temporary slavery, and then they made that impossible. They were doing that essentially to get out of debts.
Much of it was the aristocrats trying to maintain power.
The peasants kept leaving.
A lot of the death was famine.
Yes,
I mean,
huge numbers.
If there had been another person there, would they have been able to prevent, a famine that was really driven by bad crop yields?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe a more efficient system, but so maybe there was no one that could rise to this. Again, it's a fair point, and it's a real good question. But it's hard to believe anybody that was there was going to be the one.
Yeah.
Yeah. What we also have to remember is that the history of late medieval, early
modern,
early 17th, 18th century Russia is not the history of France and Britain, where a certain amount of control gets placed on the nobility for a variety of reasons. There is no Magna Carta or a Magna Carta-like event in the Soviet or in Russia. Sorry, I'm flashing back to calling them the Soviets for some reason. But they are a totalitarian, dictatorial, pretty much the sort of government that you would expect. Another piece of the puzzle is that Russia, in some ways, really is on the frontier. There is quite a bit of Russia that at this point is barely explored, and it's certainly wide open area with some very aggressive and nasty neighbors to the south.
I mean, a bunch of Russia at this period is still essentially the leftover Khanate, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, it's hard to say what's even Russia down there.
I even saw a theory that Dmitri's death, that he wasn't killed by Godunov, but was killed by the remnants of a Khanate that were trying to challenge Godunov's tsardom, and so that he was killed actually as a completely different plot, anti-Godunov, which would mean that all of these rumors that stuck to Godunov throughout his entire reign, that he was illegitimate and had specifically killed Dmitri, were false, and that's kind of
might have been a plot.
Yeah, that was the plot.
It's the official story is hard to.
I mean,
so that's interesting, and you could see that. And when you talk about the borders, and it's hard to say. I mean, this is a toughie too, because Peter the Great comes around 100 years later, and he does a lot. So the idea is, if you had someone, maybe reforms would have come earlier.
Yeah.
But then you might not have gotten the Romanovs, and then you might not have gotten Peter the Great, who did reforms. So it's a little hard to tie this through to modern Russian history to say, would the Russian Revolution have occurred if there had been a competent heir to Ivan the Terrible? That's 300 years difference, and an interesting 300 years in Russian history. It's hard to say, but in terms of territory, the other question then is, who are they taking territory from? Are they taking it from Poland, Lithuania? Are they taking it from Sweden? Are they taking it from the Ottomans? Are they taking it from the Holy Roman Empire? And that all, because all of those are significant in their own way, then it asks a real question. If Russia was much more powerful in the 17th century, who is weaker because of it, and how does it change what they impacted in history? And if they had, significantly impacted the Habsburgs, then maybe the War of Spanish Succession isn't a big deal.
Yeah.
Right. And so the broader impacts could be huge just because there's so much going on at the time that that a weak Russia impacts. But it's hard to, when you start trying to draw that forward and try to say how would it affect it. I mean, how would the world be different today? It's hard for two reasons. One is just the distance, but the other is that because of Peter the Great, because he so changes the equation, and he comes about because of the Romanov rule, which comes about because of the fall of the Rurik dynasty. So I mean, it really is a cross your eyes sort of question, because the impacts could be massive in terms of European history and Asia Minor too. I mean, in terms of, what if that territory was being taken from they were fighting all the time with the Ottomans, right? And at some point they actually kill the Sultan, right? So I mean, what if Russia is able to avoid the troubles, somehow avoid the million loss or something like that, be powerful enough that Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden don't want to mess with them? I mean, might there not be an Ottoman Empire come the time of the First World War? And that's something that could affect modern history. What if they literally overthrew the Ottoman Empire? What if they literally took Istanbul and it was part of the Russian Empire?
Yeah, there's so much fruit there for the picking. There's a lot of really, really juicy what ifs. I will say that the time of troubles, I think, is ordained, and the reason that I say that is because of our good friend, rogue volcanoes spewing large amounts of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. Apparently, in 1600, there was a huge volcanic explosion, and so the famine of 1600 through 1602 or 1603 is something that occurs from a natural disaster. And a lot of what Goodenough was facing when he was in power and looking at reforms, at least one of his reforms was that if you are a serf and your master does not feed you during a time of famine, you can pack up and go. That definitely is a direct factor of where basically is responding to the famine that's caused by by natural disaster. Goodenough, I think, also largely, if you look at what he was doing, it was not transformative. He was not declaring that Muscovy and Moscow somehow needed to, reform their religious and or legislative practices. It really was kind of a continuation.
Much more of that came from under Ivan the Terrible, who did some. I mean, he essentially wiped out the ruling class and replaced them with his own, essentially people who were loyal to him only. But ultimately, most of what Goodenough was doing was trying to deal with problems that were already there. So they were running out of, the peasants were moving and leaving because they couldn't make their own food. They weren't happy, which was just absolutely depressing their base. And so he was trying all the things he does. It was all about trying to maintain this tax base, which they needed. Because of all the money that they had spent under Ivan the Terrible, and all of that destabilization helps lead to where they end up in the time of troubles. But you're right, there was no avoiding that famine.
But I mean, there's generally a belief that food supplies could have been much better distributed, and that a competent government could have mitigated the impacts of the famine. But there's, the time of troubles, it's also the invasions, but it's also a lot of social upheaval. Is that social upheaval the inevitable part of the transition from feudalism to monarchy, which everybody is facing at the time? Or was that something that could have been managed by someone that like Ivan Ivanovich or a Peter the Great of his time? It's a good question. I mean, maybe the time of troubles there was nothing anybody could have done, and maybe that was just the end of that dynasty, and we're going to be moving on to the Romanov dynasty anyway. But it certainly seems that when the Romanovs come back into power, and it's only like a 15-year period.
Yeah.
When the Romanovs come back into power and you get a competent monarch that has the will of the people behind him, they're able to bring a significantly greater amount of stability. That seems to be, it doesn't seem to be like that there was a massive change in the situation in Russia. It was just a matter of having a competent monarch in charge.
They turned it around quickly. And I mean, most of the stuff they lose to Poland and Sweden within the next century, they retake. One of the things that I read, one of the problems that Godunov had was that there had really been a movement of this divine right of kings that had impacted Russia significantly. And so the Rurikid dynasty and people who were a part of that dynasty carried that aura of we're here by God's right. And so his argument was one of the problems is that anyone who followed after, if they weren't a part of that dynasty, they faced an uphill battle trying to prove their legitimacy. And so if Ivan the Fifth comes through and doesn't have to fight that battle, that might be enough to alter a lot of that. And Godunov is unable to defray his issues enough to, really cement his power. And then in comes Dmitri, and that first false Dmitri's got too many Poles. Gosh, there's a point when you get to around 1610 where Russia was literally just chaos. It was whatever warlord was in control. No one
had authority. Yeah,
they truly lost.
That's why they're claiming to be Dmitri, is because they feel they have to have the connection. Yeah, but of course, Fyodor, am I pronouncing it Fyodor, whatever, the second son, didn't have that issue. He was just apparently utterly incompetent.
Although he was fairly well liked. One of the reasons they'll talk about the time of trouble starting when Fyodor dies, as opposed to back when Dmitri dies or when Godunov really kind of comes into power, was that people liked Fyodor and they actually liked how pious he was, but otherwise was apparently completely useless.
Yeah, he's kind of a Henry VI.
Yeah, and so you wonder if he had some advantage even then, and he was never really at risk of losing his power. And so, maybe that was what was supporting, maybe that's why Godunov was able to do what he did, was purely because he had this veneer. And then once he lost that veneer, he really starts to lose control of the situation. Because Fyodor dies without any heir. And that's really where the dynastic crisis comes in.
There's, two things that come up here immediately. And that is when you start talking about piety, we also have to definitely qualify that with Eastern Orthodox piety, because this will become just a few years later with False Dmitri, probably the number one reason that Dmitri lasted less than a year, and that was the perception that he was a Latin, not Orthodox.
No, it also he was brought to power by the aristocracy, and then he wasn't satisfying the aristocracy, but. You have to, that guy had a great way to die, though. Fall out a window, break your leg, chopped to pieces, burned to ashes, shot out of a cannon. That's the fact that they shot him out of a cannon in the direction of Poland. It's just that's almost as good as the fact that they punished the bell and sent it to Siberia to show you how, but also how much symbolism meant, and that the Tsardom is as symbolic as anything else at this point.
Yeah, and this is another thing about that we can't necessarily comprehend, but this is an age where literally you can get an angry mob, you can raise the angry mob, and they will literally storm the palace and do very, very bad things to the people living in said palace. There's not enough of a security apparatus to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, there's points where they've completely lost the army. The Tsar has no real protection,
And this also, of course, takes another one of the backdrops is the fact that the region that we would call the Ukraine now, Galatia, I believe that it was contemporaneously known as the wild something, the wild lands or the wild south, something to that effect. But essentially, that was where the Cossacks lived. And the Cossacks play such a huge role so many times in the history of Russia, sometimes as the good guys, sometimes as the bad guys. But when Cossacks get restive, usually it's a sign that something is going awry, and they show up and are very, very good at what they do, which apparently is, at least in some cases, if they're angry enough, they will commit war and really serve as a foil to absolute Muscovy power.
Yeah, and we're put military force up through the Second World War, but the False Dmitri II found out what don't piss off a Cossack.
The Cossacks do play. I mean, they end up playing a role in this. Is that almost every one of these rebellions, of which there were many, was supported by Cossacks in one way or another, which was another force that there were ways that Godunov had changed that. I mean, it's in an attempt to control them and to get tax money from them, and they again didn't like that, and that was a rather large chunk of why they continued to just be available to build an army. Because gosh, these Dmitriads, if there's a stronger Russia, you think that there maybe Dmitri wouldn't have been able to pull as much power. Because Poland is not going to, obviously, if not quite openly, support Dmitri as he walks into Russia, unless they think there's enough destabilization there that might work out. And Dmitri II only, and the third for that matter, only exist and only are successful at all because there are Cossacks willing to back them, which has less to do with who they were or who they claimed to be, and more to do with the fact that the Cossacks were ready to fight no matter what.
Yes. Those Cossacks. Pansy French all needing a guillotine. We don't need a guillotine to take your head.
We'll shoot you and then chop you.
Well, I mean, the two just rode by and cut his head off, right out of the carriage. And he didn't come back that time, so don't cut my head off. Burn me to ashes and shoot me out of a cannon. It's apparently a very specific ritual.
Muscovy always has kind of they've got a wild card loose cannon ally, which are the Cossacks, because oftentimes the Cossacks come in and basically serve as the light cavalry and sweep the Swedes or the Polish or like the Cossacks or whoever from the field, and then sometimes they come and cut off the head.
They're like any other
of the song. It's just
what you would call auxiliary troops. If they get bored, then they're a very potent and dangerous force. Yeah, and warrior people of the steppes were able to wreak a lot of havoc, and the question is whether you could keep them pointed the direction that you wanted to.
And of course, the various rulers of Russia from the 9th century on, they're consistently trying to consolidate the areas. They're trying to bring the Cossacks under control, and they're just not having a whole lot of success with it. Yeah. So I think this is why the Cossacks play such a huge role in this. Now back to one possible counterfactual, and that is if Ivan V takes the throne. I think the time that you don't get necessarily the time of troubles, because I think what happens is, assuming that he's relatively competent and he's not rubbing the boyars the wrong way, when the crisis hits in 1600 through 1603, he's not in a position where there's uncertainty, where there's some court intrigue going on. Instead, I think he'd be able to more effectively focus, unless he was just himself incompetent, which did not seem to be the case.
It seems like he was actually prepared and likely could have been a reasonable error. But there's part of the argument too is that if he had lived, if his dad hadn't clubbed him with the scepter, that he might have been able to mitigate some of Ivan's more radical sorts of tendencies. Because of course, obviously, he was given to his emotions from the fact that he killed his son, and that leaves this kind of interesting question: what if Dmitri had actually survived? Because we know very little about what this 9-year-old boy was like, but clearly, the people of that village had some loyalty to him, and so maybe there was some potential there. So if you think that Ivan Ivanovich might have been the obvious one that could have at least mitigated the troubles. Then it's an interesting question to say, what if there was not a false Dmitri, but a real Dmitri, and what might he have been, and could he have been someone that could have impacted the situation? Or again, back to was this all just going to happen? Yeah. And was it were these the social troubles, because they would have had the external pressures any which way, and they would have had at least the crop failures any which way. And so, whether one personality could have then, made that into something that wouldn't be called the time of troubles, that's an interesting. But how that you could lose 1.5 million people and just see that, the empire fall literally into chaos over a period that's really just, less than a decade and a half is really extraordinary. And you have to think that there was somebody that could have kept that situation under control.
It is shocking. It's shocking that after this, Russia comes out as essentially a unified state. close to the same lines that it had been. Because the idea that this, turns into a dozen different kingdoms or nation states of some kind is not impossible. I mean, it's incredible that after everything, they bring in the Romanovs, they rally behind them, and Russia goes on as normal. Because when you look at this period, I mean, it is crazy how close they came to just absolutely total collapse. In some ways, you would say that they kind of crossed that line. At the point in 1610 where they've got rebellions going around, there's the False Dmitri II going around, the Poles are invading, the Swedes are invading, essentially with just free reign. With the only forces fighting against them being disconnected local forces. I mean, it's crazy that they were able to turn that around really in such a short period of time.
Very quickly.
Yeah,
and I mean it was such a tenuous link too, because the Romanovs were descendants of the brothers of one of the wives of Ivan, right?
Yeah.
And that was still, it was just a matter of something everybody would agree upon. Yeah. So maybe that's just all you needed is that you needed someone that everybody could at least say. So we need something in control here. You just need someone they'd pick. Or was it that? And I'm sorry, was the first Romanov? Was
Michael?
Mikhail.
Yeah.
Yeah. Was he that extraordinary, or was it just such a power vacuum that you just needed someone?
I think that. Well, first of all, he was able to stack the deck. He was able to get his father was assigned as the metropolitan of Muscovy for the Eastern Orthodox Church. So that guaranteed that the religious flank of his rulership was covered. And then he ruled for, I think, 31 years. So he had the advantage of continuity. As well as having the Eastern Orthodox Church literally being held down by his dad for about the first 13 years of the reign. So it is definitely, he definitely had a good setup, and the early Romanovs they were competent. I believe they really did well. Something that I ran into in my research that I want to harken back to real quick was, and I did not see a citation on this, so I can't say whether it's real or not. But at one point, one of the videos on YouTube was talking about the False Dmitri, and there was a quote from a contemporary who claimed that young Dmitri, unlike other children, loved to watch the slaughter of animals and was not scared of the blood in the same way that a normal child is. He was truly his father's son. And I'm very badly paraphrasing that, but essentially that was the quote. But there was no citation, and I could not figure out.
It's the sort of thing that could have been said afterwards too, because they're trying to justify these guys too. I don't know if I've personally seen that. Yeah,
I don't remember seeing that one specifically, but ultimately, it's so hard to know exactly what. Essentially, he appears in history. In terms of firm sources, in order to die, like that's all he.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah,
we know he was 3 years old when his father dies. They are sent to Oglich, and then he dies. And we don't know a whole lot.
We don't know a lot about the guy. Yeah.
Yes, until apparently he shows up and decides that getting fired out of a cannon is really the way to go. So.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to appreciate how unique the time is, not just that they flogged the bell, which is just always the most the humorous part of it, but that you have a series of wars that are literally named after all the guys who were claiming to be a dead child. I mean, the name the Demetriads is historically just almost comic to say how chaotic the situation was. That it would be like, if we had people who were claiming that they were Abraham Lincoln, reincarnated or whatever, and we had the Abrahamiads or something like that after the president was killed. I mean, we know he's dead, and yet we're still having wars over everybody who's claiming to be the dead guy. That is just bizarre. So, I mean, it wasn't just that we had these false Dmitris. It was literally called the time of the false Dmitris. Really shows kind of how chaotic Russia was.
Well, and the opportunity, I mean, clearly Dmitri's death, or his death under the circumstances that they could even argue that they were, although no one really believed it. Most of the people at the time don't seem to have believed it. No historian has ever taken it particularly serious. I mean, yeah, I don't think that any of them were actually Dmitri. I mean, Dmitri died.
Oh no,
died in Oak Ridge. It is awfully hard to imagine that he escaped that. But because of his death, he allowed essentially an excuse for these various powers that were interested in, taking advantage of Russia's weakness anyway. But it shows how important, the idea of Dmitri was, that they continued to use him, and that they still thought it was so important that we connect to Ivan the Terrible.
Yeah, and I mean, Ivan got that epitaph later by historians.
Yeah.
So I mean, you get this idea that he must have been this horrible, evil man. But obviously, no. I mean, he's so respected that they want to have that connection to him. But he died in such a bizarre way that I mean, even today, you'd be like,
that doesn't sound.
If that happened today, you'd be like, yeah, it was Putin.
Yeah, obviously, died having an epileptic seizure.
Because of that, then you see why it's not all that hard to believe. Oh, that wasn't. We had smuggled the boy out. We had killed a doppelganger or someone that looked like him. I mean, you can see that becomes believable. When you're looking in the context of the whole thing. I mean, at the point that you're flogging the bell, obviously, people are believing quite a lot of anything at this point.
Yeah.
And that is maybe as symbolic of the Troubles as anything else. Mm-hmm. The people were just so desperate for a story that they could buy a story. Well, I mean, then, the guy that they shot out of a cannon a year later. I mean, because that is always funny to me, too. He didn't claim, oh, that wasn't the real Dmitri. I'm the real Dmitri. He claimed that was me.
That was me.
That was me.
You missed.
Yeah, you missed. You shot the wrong guy out of a cannon. Somehow I escaped and I've come back. And of course, they pulled his wife out and said, "You want to be locked in the nunnery again, or you want to say this guy's your husband?" She's like, "Oh, sure."
Yeah. You can't take any. I mean, they pull his mother out of a nunnery too, and they're like, "Isn't this your son?" And she's like, "Yeah."
Sure. Yeah. Will it get me out of your jail?
The idea that any of them really believed it is more difficult to. But certainly, I mean, if you're a peasant or a Cossack or whatever, you might have more reason to believe it purely because you're only going to have heard it as like a distant rumor. Mm-hmm. And so you don't necessarily have like we do, this ability to look at a bunch of sources and be like, I mean, obviously this guy died, and somebody who was following Dmitri might have actually believed that he was Dmitri, but the people the powerful people who supported him, I don't think any of them did. None of the Polish nobles thought that they were actually.
Even at the time, they were called the False Dmitri.
Yes,
I mean,
yes, there were very few people who honestly believed that he was Dmitri.
And there's no one by the time you got to three. So there were three main False Dmitris, but there were as many as a dozen. Total.
Well, that
False Dmitris.
One of the things I was reading about, because I was reading a book on this as we were preparing for this episode. There were a bunch of other pretenders who didn't pretend to be Dmitri, but pretended to be a son of Fyodor or a long-lost cousin who were claiming to be Tsareviches. And actually multiples of them were killed by the false Dmitris because, False Dmitri doesn't actually want false bunch of other guys who claim to have a claim on the throne. So he was killing all these dudes who were showing up. I guess to be like.
Well, when the Romanovs take power, they kill the sons of the second false. They get rid of the false Dmitri line there. Yeah.
We didn't fully mention it, but the kid they hang, that was the son. He was 3 years old. That is a disturbing image
harsh.
That they hung a 3-year-old over the.
Wait, so he was 3 and they strangled his wife? So how old was his wife?
This would have been his mother. This was the son of Dmitri II.
Yeah.
They just can't have a pretender around, yeah.
Yeah, this is, the veneer of civilization is only as thick as we make it. And this is at a time when civilization, I don't even think you can make a claim that a lot of these places are, quote, civilized, in that they've got some kind of functioning and more or less operative systems of justice and prevention of government abuses. Very much during a period where autocracy is the word of the day. And horrible things being done to people on a whim of a single person or a small group of people is certainly not
Yeah.
unheard of. In fact, it's the norm.
There were parts of the empire where they were depopulated 50% over a period of a little over a decade. So when a million people have died, then the murder of a 3-year-old doesn't seem nearly as as horrific as it is to look at today.
He was certainly not the only 3-year-old that died. I mean, there were
Definitely.
a lot of toddlers who died in horrible ways, in this period. You do see, because they literally just had a war with a bunch of people who claimed to be, especially because you have to imagine the Romanovs knew that there was some chance that their rule was not as secure as they'd like it to be.
Yeah, at the point, I mean, they were aiming for legitimacy right there,
Yeah. But it ultimately, a lot of what happens in the time of troubles, it feels like, are inevitable. If we start at after Ivan the Terrible, sometimes some of that destabilization is going to happen. And so the whole question becomes, how do you minimize it? It seems like the best way that they could have minimized it is with Ivan Ivanovich. And the only other way that changes is if, like you mentioned at the beginning of this, you have a great man show up and someone who is able to unite people. And certainly there were a lot of folks who tried to be that guy. There were a lot of people who came in trying to be the person who could change everything, and they just weren't able to. None of the Dmitriads. There were a group of various, between Godunov and Godunov's son, and there was another guy who seizes power briefly. All of those people tried to be the one that came out on top, and it was just it was a dog pile of all kinds of different powers. I mean, Jesus, the Poles tried to be on top. They clearly Sigismund hoped to take the throne. Sweden at one point tried to get like a Swedish duke on top of the throne, and none of it ends up turning out. And maybe that speaks
that's another interesting counterfactual.
Yeah.
What if the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had literally taken control of Russia? What if Russia became, part of the Commonwealth?
Would they have found it as
different.
difficult to rule as the Russians did, or would that have essentially? You're talking about
presumably the other countries of Europe were facing the famine as well, or
Yeah.
facing the crop failures and stuff, and they did weather. But I
That's
mean,
true.
what if the people of Russia had accepted that? I mean, then rolling into the modern era, if you had connected the Commonwealth to Russia and they remained as a single entity, then that because the Habsburgs were still playing a major role in the First World War, and so
that alters.
could that have been
that certainly
I don't know
alters
that
the geopolitics.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the Commonwealth was ever going to be able to hold on that harsh line that you just draw, which is this is Eastern Orthodox,
That's
this
true.
is Catholic,
That was a
there
difficult.
the twain shall meet. It is kind of an oil and water thing, and that of course at various times the fact that Russia is Eastern Orthodox plays in history. Sometimes it's to Russia's advantage, and sometimes it is a card that gets played against them. So, and I think that's where really, I think that this is probably one of the reasons that there's always been this image of Russia as a backwards nation. And part of that is that the Western Catholic, and then later on post-Reformation, obviously your Protestant kingdoms, they have at least we have the common ancestor religion, but those shifty Eastern Orthodoxers, how dare they try to play power politics in our sphere?
Because it's the Russian Orthodox Church.
Yes.
Right. I mean, it's not even.
It was under Ivan that the first metropolitan in Moscow that was not appointed by the head of the church in Constantinople was appointed under Ivan the Terrible, and so, or right in this same area. So this was, it was very much. He was able to do so much to build this kind of identity of a Russian state in really a very short time, and you have to think that must have been very ingrained. And I think it has a lot to do with, like Brad's talking about, the religion, that they were able to rebuild and remain a single group, a single entity, beyond the absolute chaos. Poland would have had to have pretty much wiped out Eastern or Russian Orthodoxy in order to hold that land.
But I mean, the Russian, when you look at the Soviet Union, we were talking a very, very diverse
That's
people.
fair.
And I mean, Russia was never what you would call a unified piece. Still isn't today. There's actually a really interesting document that was made during the Second World War when the Russians were our friends, talking about how diverse Russia is as our ally, which is really interesting because like 2 years later we're doing
Going the exact opposite.
We're spinning a whole different storyline. But so I mean, why if Russia can combine such a diverse people,
Why couldn't
Poland? Why couldn't they have
I do think that if Poland did keep and control any of it, it seems very unlikely to me that they would control past the Urals. It feels like Siberia breaks off to me. And whether that's as some kind of Russian rump state.
How will they hang on is something. But I mean, even up until World War II, well, I mean, Poland was part of the USSR, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so Russia was trying to dominate Poland. And believe that the Polish people could be Russianized.
It's true.
So I mean, the Baltic states too. So I mean, if they could combine in the modern era, if Russia could combine that mix, then why is it impossible in that era? Because I mean, that's when you want to talk about a broad counterfactual.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what if we have a very different Russia? Because they don't have the time of troubles. And by a very different Russia, or because they have the time of troubles, either which way. Very different meaning they end up dominated by Sweden, or they end up dominated by Poland, or they end up dominating Sweden, or they end up dominating Poland, or they end up dominating the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottomans, the Habsburgs, are still significant players even into the 20th century.
Yeah.
And that's where you can see, I mean, it's really, it's a broad question here. That's the really broad question is what might Russia have been, and then how much of that might have carried forward, into the modern era.
Well, and Russia ends up being so powerful and is such a defining force throughout that whole period. That's whether you're talking about Napoleon, the Napoleonic era, or you're talking about all the way to World War One.
True.
If Russia is only a little different, it could have massively altered how those turned out.
So you can ask if what happened at the time of Ivan the Terrible, could that have prevented the Russian Revolution? That's an odd line to draw, right? And I mean, to make Russia very different today. But the Russian Revolution ties a lot to what was going on in Ivan the Terrible, and that they never did resolve the class issues that eventually that were both the time of troubles and eventually leads to the revolution. But I mean, could something have changed in the 17th century that would have changed Russia in the 20th century? Is a really interesting question. And one of those would have been if Sigismund had taken the throne of Russia.
First of all, the Russians were defeated in World War I by the Germans. Yeah. So that was, that's an observation that they still had their moments where they were not superpowers. However, I do think that if Russia develops differently, perhaps they don't look directly at Sweden and the Polish-Lithuanian, as well as the Habsburg areas. What if they decide, there's a good bunch of Slavic peoples down in southern Central Europe?
I mean, that's eventually where they go in the First World War, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
they tried to become the leader of the Slavs.
Yeah, they tried.
I mean, Russia was defeated because they were behind in reform. Their military was behind. Their draft system was behind, and not far behind because I mean they were a major player in the First World War. But why was Prussia ahead of Russia at that time? And could stopping that 13-year period of the time of troubles had made that difference? Yeah. Because is there any functional reason why Russia had to be something that could be defeated by the Prussians?
Yeah. If the Rurik dynasty continues and you have your typical an occasional really good leader followed by several fairly mediocre leaders and with the occasional bad apple, do you get a Russia that's capable of challenging the Ottoman Empire, especially as you're getting towards the late 19th and early 20th century when Turkey really is the sick man of Europe?
And that's a hard, well, and the Crimean War and all that too, but that's a hard one because under the Romanovs you get some great leaders,
Yeah.
right? And so so it's difficult to see, that they'd have been better off if the Rurik dynasty had continued, because the Romanovs end up being, people that do reform the system. But I
Yeah.
mean, that might be different if just in that 15-year period, if they are 13 years, if they survive better, if they come out in a much more unified position, and therefore they take a bunch more territory in that period, then that might put Russia in a different position, regardless of, Peter the Great or whoever.
Because ultimately they have to spend most of the next century recovering stuff that they lost during the time of troubles.
Half their population. I mean,
Oh yeah, gosh, that.
And it's also true that if they had been a little more effective going south and were able to lock down the breadbasket areas of the Ukraine, that has one of the stories I was looking at today declared that this is literally the most fertile earth on all of the earth. And he had identified that Muscovy has troubles because just because of how far north they are, because of the weather patterns and everything else, you really don't get bumper crops in Russia. Russia is not known as a grain exporter in this era until they finally are able to take full control of the Ukraine, and the Ukraine is able to be harvested with relatively modern techniques. Then they become a net food exporter.
Russia and Poland fought a war over Ukraine in between the world wars. So they're still fighting over whether that was Poland or Russia. In what was 1921, yeah.
Yeah, and of course, can't forget that Poland got partitioned 3 times throughout history. So
that's another one. If we want to get into another set of counterfactuals, which maybe we'll do sometime. I mean, it's Poland and what happened to Poland, because they go from one of the great powers of Europe to nearly. I mean, just very nearly, they were literally erased from history.
Yeah, they were wiped off the map for sure. And then, it was tenuous.
Burn all the books. They're trying to tell you there never was a Poland.
Yeah, they were literally trying to. And we're talking about a point, in this episode, where Poland was doing almost in a position to do exactly the opposite, and do that to Russia. And
it makes you wonder what's been lost. I mean, what successfully was erased.
Was erased. Since we've been doing that apparently through all human history, trying to burn everything that doesn't agree with whatever various concepts and
history is a set of lies agreed upon,
and it changes.
Yeah, I've been trying to think of a historical timeline where the first False Dmitri actually survives for a fair period of time and has some success, but we know so little about him that it's really hard to say anything certain.
He clearly stumbled and fumbled. I mean, it seems to, when you look at the first False Dmitri, who actually did become the Tsar, that if he had, greased the right palms and better read the tea leaves, that a better man might have been able to continue that dynasty. I mean, it certainly seems like
he was at least briefly popular, and a lot of his problem. I mean, partially you wonder, was he ever going to be able to build a body of support that didn't include the Poles? Since the whole reason he was there was that the Poles had given him that support, and that had a lot to do with why he ends up getting kicked out. Is that there was too much foreign influence. He remained Catholic, married a Catholic princess. That was all problematic. But it does seem like someone who was more willing to play the game could have done that. He needed to just secure his power base, and he didn't. There were never enough Poles hanging around Russia for him to rely on them alone, to keep the boyars and various other interests at bay. And clearly, it didn't work out for him because he's only in power, for such a brief time. But I agree, is that it seems like if he had been able to go in and get some support from the boyars and maintain his support from the people, which he had a surprising amount of given how he had come to power, and had even been just a little more discreet about his foreign influence. You might have a Russia that not only continues quote unquote the Rurikid dynasty, but also is much more under the sway of Poland. Maybe not a so much of like a puppet state, but one that's certainly friendly to Poland.
Yeah, and that would have made a huge difference not to continue fighting. And could that have been? I mean, could that have changed the whole dynamics of the period of the time? Because if you have a friendly Russia and Poland, then that is quite a counterbalance to the Habsburgs there in Central Europe.
One of the things I read said that the Poles dreamed of a Catholic Russia because they hoped to be able to turn that against Sweden, because Sweden was a growing power at the time. And it's certainly true that if Poland could have relied on Russia one of the problems between those three is that whatever two of them got together, the other one fought. Those were always shifting alliances. They all fought each other. They were all fighting each other over this reason or that reason. And if you're able to have a reliable ally among those three, it shifts the whole balance of power in the region.
It's not hard to see a scenario where Russia ends up dominating Sweden. And Sweden essentially winds up as part of Russia. And if that was true, then Germany could not have fought either world war without iron from Sweden. Right? So what if by the 20th century Sweden is just recognized as part of Russia, like other diverse parts of Russia, then the Germans have to invade Sweden, have to defeat Russia in order to have any chance of being able to fight.
And it completely alters because it means that the Russians would know that, and of course Hitler ends up attacking them anyway. But if what kind of strategic thinking would Russia be going through if they think that war is more inevitable because they know that that Germany needs Sweden, as opposed to the position that they were in.
So if you don't have an independent Sweden that is willing to sell iron ore, there's no rise of Prussia. And if there's no rise of Prussia as a military power, the wars of the 20th century go away, or they're at least radically different, right?
Yeah, definitely radically.
Prussia ended up driving so much of it.
We have to remember that the Baltic, much like the Mediterranean, is a huge economic region where if you're simply willing to build enough ships, you can create quite a bit of trade and wealth that way. And there are certainly a lot of natural resources in the area, not just the obviously iron from Sweden is important, but without Sweden, then what happens to Germany? Does Germany take a back seat and never rise to a major power because the Baltic and the economic prosperity that comes from being on the Baltic it doesn't become a factor? Or is Sweden such a thorn in the side of Russia because these are people who have a Lutheran tradition, they speak the same language, and it's not Russian. And as we've seen with the Finns, you can roll Russians into Finland, but at one point or another, a bunch of Finnish-speaking people will take up arms and they will kick you out. Yeah, I do think that if Russia has more influence, then that means that there's a net loss to the Danes as well as the Polish-Lithuanians, and by extension, I mean, you're also going to get you're going to get the economic impacts down in the Habsburg Empire as well. So, at that point, I would say that Russia, if they can defeat Sweden, they become the major player in North Central Germany.
Mm-hmm. Well, and if that carries, another 200 years in, then that does impact, modern history as well. And certainly, I mean, the Habsburgs were never a unified empire. I mean, they always had multiple languages and, all sorts of difficulties that way. And so, I mean, it's not hard to see a more forceful Russia taking from the Habsburgs there in Central Europe. And Russia fought the Ottomans the whole existence of the empire. So, I mean, they could have, again, there's major empires here. And the question is, if there is a bigger Russia, a more muscular Russia,
Yeah.
who is disadvantaged by that? That really says, that says something about the future of the battle. I mean, if they had dominated the Ottomans in this period, then you don't get the Crimean War, right? Which is really over who's going to dominate the dying Ottoman Empire. And so, I mean, there's depending on who they might have taken from, then that could move into the modern. We could see the impacts into the modern era because a lot of those borders really did come from this era.
Well, and at minimum, the time of troubles allowed a lot of people, a lot of these powers to breathe, while Russia was not a threat.
Yep. Also having Russia as the junior partner in an alliance against whoever the third guy was, knowing that Russia's not powerful enough to really take a bite out of me. But I will certainly ally with Russia, and between Russia and I, then Sweden will surely back down.
Yeah, there was fighting there because there was a claim. Poland had a claim. Sigismund had a claim on the Swedish throne, which that was constantly an issue. But if Sigismund has any kind of dynasty in Russia, maybe that just complicates things because it means then you have two more monarchies that are vaguely connected and have people willing to fight over them.
So, I mean, in that sense, that even if the troubles were just inevitable, if there was nothing you could have done about it, certainly how that impacted Russia, I mean, in terms of domination by other foreign powers, still could easily have happened.
Yeah, I also think here's another possibility. If Poland is able to more effectively occupy Muscovy and the areas of Russia. What happens if Russia starts picking up on some of the ideas of a commonwealth versus an autocratic, basically an autocratic oligarchy? Because you've got the boyars, and then you have the Tsar, and to an extent they counterbalance one another. But what if you introduce a little more, I don't want to call it liberal, but a little more responsive system that puts some more controls over the absolutism of Russia at this time, which was known as the Age of the Monarchs, except for
there were certainly lots of people who wanted a voice in those within Russia.
And again, England got their Magna Carta, which created a more or less functioning balance between a legislative and executive political system, where political power is not concentrated in a single.
Especially given given how diverse Russia is, if you had some sort of semi-autonomous empire, I don't know. I mean, I think they were still struggling for that in the 50s, right? I've been trying to figure out how to do that in the USSR. Was hard enough trying to do that in the 17th century. I don't know. It's interesting. What if Russia had literally created a different system than we saw anywhere else in the world? What if they had modernized more quickly in terms of political freedoms? And maybe Russia could be the great enlightened state that brought on the modern era, and as opposed to a state that was still seen as backwards even into the 20th century.
Yeah, that one would be that's a hard alternate history story to write, I think.
Yeah,
it is. Unless, of course, the Russian Bigfoot, which is called the Almasty, which is more like a wild man. If they became involved, then because we always have to get there, right? So I mean, it would be a total black swan for it to be. I mean, this is at the time of troubles when it falls into chaos. That is the time when the system is in such flux that maybe something radical could have occurred and just didn't. Could it have leapt Russia forward as opposed to sending Russia behind, even if you couldn't avoid the famine? I mean, times of troubles are also times of opportunity to see a new way to run things. So it's not. I guess it's not inconceivable.
That's some version of a different system, whether that's a more democratic system from our perspective or not, but it certainly could have been different, and ultimately they end up falling essentially in the same system. The Romanovs were at least initially, that was essentially the same system that Ivan the Terrible had basically created, but still based on autocracy. And
yeah, I mean, what an irony if they'd actually became earlier capitalists. I mean, if they were the first truly capitalist system and that empowered a working class through capitalism, then that would be an irony in that, modern Russia became the whole symbol of communism and so forth.
Yeah.
Well, and certainly, I mean, some of that could have changed. This was a place where maybe a big idea could have altered that.
Yeah. Because it was a place that was lacking big ideas. There was in a power vacuum. It's hard to say what could have occurred. Yeah. What if they had found a Napoleon? 200 years ahead of Napoleon.
And they're certainly, I mean, that's one of the cool things about this period of time is that they could have. This was a place where someone like, any of these Dmitris, the ones who we do think we even know who they were essentially no ones who were able to rise, however briefly, to significant positions of power. But certainly, the first Dmitri, that might have been just some dude who essentially, he didn't even have to look like Dmitri because most people didn't know what Dmitri looked like. He just would have, but he was able to essentially rule a country. And if he had done it, with a little more intelligence, he might have literally built for himself a throne.
The man who would be king.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Counterfactual History, and if you did, you can find lots more history if you follow the History Guy on YouTube. You can also find us at thehistoryguy.com, Facebook, Patreon, and Locals. If you want to hear more counterfactuals, stay tuned. We release podcasts every 2 weeks.